Hello, Frank.
Good afternoon, Brian.
Thinking about what's been going on in the world today, it seems as though there's a lot happened in the last week. And it all has something that really ties it together. It all has to do with the authority of state governments. And so I thought maybe we'd talk about that today. I think the first thing that hit my awareness was the UBS cover-up.
Yes.
And that seems to have dropped out of the news very quickly. I suppose 2.3 billion isn't enough money to really bother anybody for very long. But then, actually today, there's the UN General Assembly. I don't know whether Ahmadinejad is talking today.
He spoke this morning.
Oh, it was. And there's Durban 3, which is a UN sponsored meeting, which I think is happening at the United Nations, which is generating a lot of intergovernmental anguish. Most of the Western governments have, I think, refused to attend anymore, and the whole thing has become very politicized, which is the opposite of what it was meant to be in the first place. And a series of things like that keep happening. And since one of the first things people ever said about globalization, starting 15 years ago or so, was that it was the end of the nation state. Obviously the nation state is still doing very well, but other things are happening as well, and it seems to me that the role of the nation state is changing. So I thought that might be a good way to pitch our discussion today.
I think, and we had exchanged some emails on this, but I think your points are very present at the moment. I'm watching what Ahmadinejad did with the release of the two hikers, which he made it very clear he wanted to get done before he came to New York to meet with the other UN delegates and be exposed to the Western media. I saw what happened down in Georgia last night, where a person had been convicted by a Georgia state jury, a Georgia state court. The Georgia State Supreme Court upheld it, and he was on death row. And for a complete voluntary reason, the governor of Georgia held the execution while the Supreme Court of the United States determined whether or not they were going to review it or not. And then when they decided not to, they let it go. And I look at what happens in China right now, a relatively totalitarian society, let's face it, that has been taking in money hand over fist for infrastructure projects, with the embarrassment they're facing on the crash of the high-speed trains. It used to be that nobody cared about this sort of outside interference. You really only cared about what your subjects or your citizens or the people inside your borders were articulating insofar as opinions go. Now it seems very strident people, with the exception of the leader of North Korea, actually pay attention to what world opinion is. It's sort of striking.
I wonder whether, in fact, absolute totalitarianism is possible any longer. But if you look at this historically, since Niccolo Machiavelli coined the idea of a state, the state has gradually been becoming more and more influential, powerful, comprehensive, taking over everything that happens in the country, very gradually up through the 19th century, but at a much faster rate during the 20th century. And Soviet totalitarianism was probably the ultimate totalitarianism, where the government absolutely controlled everything. And since 1991, when that dissolved, we've begun to see that everywhere popular opinion, even in states that think of themselves as one-party states, I don't think any of them actually call themselves totalitarian, public opinion is gradually becoming more and more important. And then, of course, the issue is, so what's it leading to?
Well, I think the starting point, I think, is always information. In the Soviet Union, Xerox machines were outlawed samizdat, which was the unofficial illegal transmission of manuscripts and magazines on the underground market, was like a capital offense. Anytime information was being brought in behind the walls, it caused great havoc and concern. I mean, for years, back in the 60s, American evangelicals south of the 38th parallel in Korea used to attach transistor radios to helium balloons and floated them into North Korea. They're still doing that, just so North Koreans would have a radio that they could listen to Western news or music. So I think if the starting point is information, and then with the tools that exist now with the internet and social media, you compound the information with the social interaction. To go back on the definition that we've often been using of globalization, I mean, you have communities that are springing up that run across borders.
I think the reason that the Soviet Union was able to hold on to a central power over the whole country for so long probably has something to do with the fact that it had a population of less than 300 million distributed over 11 time zones.
That's a good point.
Whereas China has, 1.3 billion now, and wasn't much less than that when it was still completely totalitarian through the 80s. The population was much denser and therefore much more difficult to control, even before the information revolution.
So where do you think it's all going?
Well, I think that really so much of what we think about other countries now is ideological. We're very much under the influence of our government's propaganda and what the New York Times is willing to tell us, and it's not quite all the news that's fit to print. And in fact, the Chinese system is there's much more public participation in what actually happens than they're given credit for. It's just that we don't like a lot of things that they do, and we assume that it's completely from the top down, but there has to be opinion that is working from the bottom up as well. The structure is completely different from the systems that we say we like. It's the same is true with Iran, of course. Iran, there is no real central authority in Iran. There's a division of powers among several. It's a much more complex system than the American system.
It is, with the religious interaction, yes.
So it's very difficult to tell how any decision actually gets made, because you have to know who's married to whom and who sees whom in the evenings, not just who's in what part of the organization as it's worked out in the Constitution. Well, the same is true of Washington, of course. You have to know who goes to whose parties in the evenings, as well as what position they're in during the day. So I think that I find China and India to be a very interesting comparison, because China, one of the most impressive things that the Chinese have done over the last 20 years is develop their infrastructure from a very poor infrastructure to an infrastructural base now, which is really quite impressive. And so when something goes wrong, like the train crash this summer, it makes enormous headlines, because we don't really want the Chinese to be ahead of everybody else. But India, we want the Indians to do well, because they're the world's largest democracy, and we're very proud of that. And we do all sorts of things with them because we want to support. We want to appear to be supporting good democracies.
And you referred me, to an article from that all the news not quite fit to print in the Times about a suburb of New Delhi.
It's Gurgaon, which the last time I was there was an identifiable suburb, but has grown enormously over the last 15 years or so, and is totally beyond government control, because democracy just doesn't move fast enough to control growth as it's been evolving in India recently, which means that companies do things for themselves.
So just so our viewers understand the perspective we're talking about, this is a suburb that is filled with gleaming office buildings, palatial homes, Mercedes-Benz 500s, upscale shops, et cetera, but yet has no sewer system, no drinkable water system, no basic infrastructure.
Every company provides its own services.
Correct, correct. All of this has been built on top of what was essentially there 50 or 60 years ago, which was not much.
Yeah. I mean, essentially the infrastructure, the transportation infrastructure of most of India is pretty much the way it was in 1947, or at least it hasn't changed much since I started going there in the 60s.
I have an interesting quote. All right, we've talked off and on about infrastructure and the services of the state, and how they sometimes lag behind the development in a country, or worse yet, as your Danish colleague or your Dutch colleague spoke about in our conversation 2 weeks ago, how sometimes American or Western infrastructure aid to emerging countries comes with conditions. And contrasting that to what sometimes seems to be going on in this country, with conservative elements and the political spectrum almost seemingly trying to tear down the infrastructure. Now, here's a quote from Elizabeth Warren, who's running for Senate in Massachusetts. "There is nobody in this country who got rich on his own. Nobody. You built a factory out there, good for you. But I want to be clear. You moved your goods to market on the roads the rest of us paid for. You hired workers the rest of us paid to educate. You were safe in your factory because of police forces and fire forces that the rest of us paid for. You didn't have to worry that marauding bands would come and seize everything at your factory. Now look, you built a factory and it turned into something terrific. Good. Keep a big chunk of it. But part of the underlying social contract is you take a hunk of that and pay forward for the next kid who comes along. Period."
I hope she gets elected.
I hope so too.
The thesis actually of more than one person who's been writing about this sort of thing is that networks are the defining feature of the globalizing world as we see it today. There have been three great thresholds. Actually, this comes out of the work of a man called Coleman, who was does get some credit for being a distinguished sociologist, but I think deserves more than he actually gets. And he unfortunately died at a not very didn't reach retirement age. He was president of the American Sociological Association, and he said there have been three major thresholds in the way human society is organized. The first one was when we got beyond dealing with people in terms of kinship and started to deal with them as categories, so we could talk to strangers and recognize them in terms of categories. The second one was when we invented corporations, which are so flexible and have been evolving as project-oriented or enterprise-oriented concerns ever since, and becoming more and more important in the modern age. And then since the internet made remote communication so much easier and completely transformed human interaction by doing that, it's networks that actually define everything that goes on. Nothing can be done that's of any significance at all, except in situations where so many people are in fact interacting in very complex ways. Nothing is independent anymore. Even the big companies in Gurgaon, south of Delhi, they're all interdependent. Now the question is, where's the government come in?
Is the government just another part of that interdependent circle, or is it a thing apart?
Well, it's the United Nations, which is where we started, is a conflab of governments. And so for that reason it's limited, and actually every United Nations meeting often has as many representatives of NGOs as it does of governments now, but they don't have votes. They're just lobbies, essentially. But I think the United Nations still does perform very useful types of puts on very useful conferences because it airs issues. The trouble is that it cannot any longer be representative. And the big challenge, I think, in the coming decades is going to be how are we going to find some way to get elected governments, which have one sort of responsibility and one sort of authority, working together efficiently with corporations that have a different different objectives and a different way of maintaining themselves, in such a way that the ordinary individual, who we would like to think has rights, has a part to play.
Well, it may just be that those bandings of interdependent groups, which clearly have had effects on nations, for example, to wit Ahmadinejad and the governor of Georgia, certainly have that same kind of influence over corporations from time to time. And those groups, I suppose, are a symptom or a manifestation of increased globalization, or the pace of it.
Yeah. Okay, I think we've reached our time for today.
Very good. Thank you, Professor.
See what happens next week.
You got it.